Okay, welcome everybody, and to this uh, this podcast, which is part of a series of podcasts looking at the interface between Christianity and economics. And I am Dr. Jay Corgan. I'm an economics professor at the University of Memphis. I'm actually based. I'm speaking from Memphis in Tennessee at the moment, and I did my. I'm from a very strong Christian background, and very interested in the moral questions around economics. I do a lot of study of the history of economic thought, and so over the years, I've developed a little bit of a critique of classical economics. Now, we have with us, a real icon of the interface between Christianity and both economics and a lot of sort of social and moral issues. I want to welcome into the studio Dr. Alan Storkey. And he has written a book called Only Christian Economics Remains, which I've been reading over the last couple of weeks and been very inspired by. Um, he's a British economist, sociologist, and artist. He's a bit of a Renaissance man in some senses. It's always quite inspiring to see a lot of. You can see a lot of his pictures. If you put his name into Google. He is married to another heavyweight of Christian thought. Especially when it comes to sort of feminist economics. Elaine Lively, and they have endless children and grandchildren, so they've got very, very, very busy lives. Um, he, like myself, studied at Cambridge, did his undergrad, and then did some sociological work at the London School of Economics, and then I'm not going to try and murder this. He did his PhD in economics at a university in Amsterdam, Vrije Universiteit, or I don't know how that's said, and where he studied consumption theory under, quite a renowned Christian economist. He then worked at Stirling University, directing the Shaftesbury Project. He was a research scholar in economics at Calvin College here in the United States, and he was the director of studies at Hill Theological College. Also had roles at Middlesex University and other institutions. He's written 8 books, mainly on economics, family life, and the arms trade. Now, in a way, that's the economist I'm talking about. There's an awful lot more to Dr. Storkey that we're probably not going to talk about because we're going to want to concentrate on the economics. But is there anything you'd like to add about your biography that you think is important for the viewers to know?
No, they know more than enough already. So
More than enough already. Okay. Okay, so I wanted to talk firstly about my reaction to the book. Um, at first, and however much you cut it, I am a trained classical economist. Anyone that's done a PhD at a non sort of heterodox institution is by nature grounded in classical economics. And so when I first started to read your book, I was like, I was coming up with all these critiques. But then after, a couple of chapters, I stepped back and thought, right, this is a very substantial piece of work. This is this is an attempted reframing of the historical and the I suppose moral and in some senses philosophical basis of economics. It's yeah, it's we'll talk about the sort of more the prophetic and the sort of visionary side of it later. But you know, it is exciting to read something like that. It's a real it's a total work. It's not like, in the sense that behavioral economics sort of critiques a little bit, pokes a little bit at classical economics, and then sort of draws away. You've attempted to do this sort of vast intellectual undertaking of sort of reframing the foundations of economics. So I wonder if you could talk about the intellectual development of these views, or these thoughts, and how have they matured over the years?
Okay. I mean, first, let's do justice to the discipline in the sense that we have studied various areas of theory. The discipline of economics has grown over 200 or 300 years, and it's become a body of knowledge that is widely used and relates to different bits of our economic life: markets, production, international trade, banking, whatever. So there's a vast amount that's there. Um, it might help to think about it as local rather than self-contained in the final word. And this is part of the picture that I think has emerged really over the last few decades, that previously the discipline was self-contained, it was academic, it was neutral and value-free as it believed, although philosophically that was rubbish from the start, and so on. So it sauntered on in its own terms, and and it believed that somehow or another it covered the whole area. And if neoclassical economics didn't cover it, then Keynes came along, and with national income economics gave the whole picture. But I want to suggest that now a lot of those analyses and conclusions are local, are often ignoring massive issues that come in on them, and so on and so forth. So, a lot of market economics is equilibrium economics, but just at present, the equilibrium in oil is up and down like a yo-yo. So something bigger is going on than just equilibrium economics. And that's the situation in most areas. So, let me just come at this in two ways. One is that in disciplinary terms, it's fairly clear that economics is related to social life, households, families that do consumption are, very important. They've got their own structure, their meanings, and their outcomes, and so on. So sociology relates to economics. Politics obviously relates to economics, both in the activities of the state and also in law and all the rest of it. Geography does, and psychology, the self, the consuming self, and psychology, and so on. So suddenly you see, you can't just take economics on its own. You have to have a bigger, more composite picture if you're going to tackle many of the issues that are out there.
One question I've got just is, you did your PhD in Amsterdam, and your thesis was on consumption theory. Your dissertation was on consumption theory. Would you say that you had, from the very beginning, were you critical of the sort of neoclassical economics, or was that something that developed later?
Uh, so so I became a Christian early in my life, read the scriptures and so on, and once I was into those, you had a whole load of questions that were up there that didn't allow you just to take economics as it was. Now, in addition, once you began reading, all kinds of things happened. I mean, at Cambridge at the time, you had Joan Robinson, who was fairly radical left, and so on. So there were already debates that were political in that sense. But once you got back into the 17th century, or socialism or Marx or whatever, you were you were dealing with value-laden issues and issues of worldview that were out there. Yeah. And, at the LSE, I read the whole of Marx and, you assess them. You assess each of them and come to conclusions. And, yeah. So, but I was just going to go on to the biblical stuff. And I mean, I'm just, I was preparing for this. I was just thinking how odd what I do seems to be compared with your average church. So when I read the Bible, and I read it a lot and reread it and so on, obviously it's full of sociology, economics, and politics. It has, we'll go on to empires later maybe, but it's got empires and kings and and so on, and especially laws, and the Mosaic laws are a very strong pattern of definition of the way the economy should work in the early state of Israel. So there's politics, there's economics, there's sociology, how you treat one another and relate to one another. So there's this vast kind of revelation of what life means that's there in the scriptures that is already forming the subject matter of economics, sociology, and other disciplines.
Excellent. We'll come back to that because I think that's very inspiring. How the Bible can speak into all this, and we'll sort of move. Let's keep going back to that area. So the thing that I wanted to talk about is what I did love about the book is this sort of in a way, these sort of prophetic sort of moments, in a sense of like critique of the capitalist system, like a sort of Old Testament prophet, speaking against the immorality of the system. It's I don't know if you're a fan of Steinbeck at all. John Steinbeck, The Grapes of Wrath. I think there was a sort of quite Steinbeckian sort of, these very, very succinct sort of talking about the sort of moral, the systemic rot in the whole thing, and this is a little bit off the economics topic, but some part of that I'm seeing a little bit of that, the sort of Dr. Alan Storkey as artist sort of coming out at me, and so do you think your interest in art and your development as an artist has added to and helped create your critique of capitalism? I'm
Uh,
thinking of sort of like, I suppose, Blake and the Dark Satanic Mill.
I mean, you can find a lot of stuff, but that's not the main. I mean, basically, I'm in the Dutch 17th century um, God-inspired viewing creation thing, and that's what the main inspirational base. I mean, there are plenty of artists who are having a go at the system. And but the point about having a go at the system is whether it's truly having a go at the system. And I don't think we do our homework. So, for example, one question is whether Britain did right by India when it controlled the empire there. And there are a number of good economists who come up with the conclusion that the scale on which we rate India economically is and was vast, absolutely vast. We were just making sure that you know they grew cotton cheaply so that we could um, make it in Lancashire and not buy it from the States, and so on and so forth. We were taxing them and so on and so forth. So there are all kinds of things that have radicalized me that are just kind of walking backwards into knowledge that is there if anybody just opens their eyes and looks at it. And quite clearly, in the 19th century, the capitalists were ripping off the workers, and Marx was right on that. I mean, his philosophy and his underlying view of economics was haywire. But in terms of the problem the workers had, which had earlier been recognised actually by the evangelical revival people. So there's a long Christian input to that tradition, and I have no problem in seeing the radical and the Christian as lining up together quite fully, especially in the Gospels. Yes.
I think that's the thing, because I think for me, in terms of my journey, I was very into Marx, and I still teach Marx because I know an awful lot about him, but I don't believe in his view of the world anymore. But it's trying to find something of substance by which you can build something else is often quite hard, But and I think that's a big question, that we think like, and because as I say, there are many people out there at the moment who are looking for like what political or what economic system is actually workable and just. And yeah, just yeah, I think we'll talk about that more in the future, but later on. But I want to go back to um, one part of the book, which, and when you've alluded to, is the critique of empire, and you're very consistent in that. From biblical view of the sort of Egyptians throughout human history. Um, and one of my big issues is with economics is that, especially as I went into economics. My wife is from Kenya, from Africa. I spent a lot of time on the African continent. Very interested in the concept of development, and when we come to development economics, it's very difficult because often the West is seen as this sort of moral force to develop, and you think, well, however much you cut it, that's very hard to sustain, and so I've been trying to come up with where does colonialism, where does empire fit in to our economic systems, and it's very hard to find sort of non-Marxist authors who've really ever said anything about this, um, um, maybe Hobson. You talk about Tawney a lot, but generally, there's just a lack of engagement in this in the world of economics. So the question I wanted to ask is, why do you think there is such a blind spot in non-Marxist economics, non-Marxist economic theory, when it comes to colonialism and empire?
So empires have been around right the way through in every area of the globe. And I mean, the ones we get in the Bible are Middle Earth ones, so Egypt and Babylon and Assyria, and then Rome. Um, and sorry, I it's just a story that I've got to tell. It's a bit off, but Jesus is asked just before the crucifixion, are we to pay taxes to Caesar or not pay taxes to Caesar? He's in the Roman Empire and so on and so forth. And they Jesus says, bring me a coin. So they bring him a coin and show him a coin. Now he knows perfectly well what the coin is because it's about all the time. It's a denarius and it will have Tiberius's face on it. And he says, and whose face is this? And they say it's Tiberius, and so on. And so and then he says, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. Now, all my life I've been just saying, well, that in a sense, one side that's fitting in with the empire, and the other side is fitting with. I wasn't quite happy with that, but that was so. So I'm looking through the web, and I come across Tiberius's hoard, and it turns out that Tiberius had a hoard of wait for it, 675 million denarii that he kept in some of the rooms locally, and presumably when he's a bit depressed, he went and counted them just to see that there were enough there to keep him happy. And so this was Tiberius's hoard, and it's also clear that everybody knew about this. So Jesus is saying, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, give him this coin back. And it's an enormous joke. I mean, it's
Ah,
set up.
I see. So you're seeing that there's some sort of hidden meaning in that
So,
parable, you know?
yeah, so Jesus both sends up the Roman Empire, and when before Pilate, my rule is by truth, yours is by force, and so there's this deep understanding of what's wrong with empire there in the scriptures. It goes back all the way through, and what is wrong with empire, you can see in a fairly straightforward economic analysis, because all the time what it does is to take money out of the people that have been subdued through taxes, through slavery or whatever, concentrate it in the center and glorify the center and build the most useless um, buildings on the planet, things like pyramids and all the rest of it. Now, so empires, whether it's Rome or in Egypt or uh, the Empire State Building or whatever, empires are all the time distorting the economies of the people they control through might, and that's been the way of the world. Now that is a big economic reality, and we Brits should be thinking about it, and so on, and everybody should. And of course, that's partly what's going on in the Middle East now. I mean, that horrific stuff is continuing right up to the present. So we're in the middle of it.
Yes, I've wondered, this is just me thinking out loud, that to think about, we'll talk about him later, but Adam Smith was actually quite anti-empire, and you you could see, in empires as these sort of global monopolies, and hence
Yeah.
wonder, sometimes within the context of classical economics, could you sort of think about the dead weight loss caused by imperial rent seeking
And the imperial preference taxes and so on. And Adam's free trade in the Adam Smith sense. There's something going for it as fair trade between equals. Uh, yeah. I just came across a nice thing in the Old Testament where Abraham insists on paying for the field and the cave where he's going to bury his wife. And so he insists on the fair trading relationship with his neighbor there.
That's good. And so we've talked about the Old Testament. Everything is segueing in very nicely here. So I really liked your chapter on the Mosaic Law. I really like the chapter on Mosaic law. The law of Moses. And you talked about the economic order embedded in Mosaic law, and you talked about the mammon as an idol, and I thought it was great. So could you tell the audience about the economical, how do you see the economic order embedded in Mosaic law?
So one of the things which so we're talking back in early times, but the Mosaic Law majors on distribution of resources. So boring bits like the Book of Numbers are numbering the tribes and the families so that land can be distributed equally among them. And then you've got the 7-year cancellation of debt and the 50-year Jubilee process where people go back to their lands. So land, which was obviously the main source of a means of living then, was equally distributed among people and not concentrated in the hands of a few. and the monarchy was actually discouraged, or anything that could concentrate wealth. And we have ignored that and concentrated wealth on a vast scale uh, through upper classes and monarchies and capitalists and all the rest of it, and not seen that if we're on the kind of right wing capitalist wing, we've not seen that as a problem. Whereas, of course, it is a problem. I mean, one of the obvious things, again, jumping a bit, but um, now some people are paid 1,000 times more than somebody else for an hour's work. Now, what the hell do they do to deserve that difference? When, on the other hand, Jesus says, um, in the when the workers in the vineyard are going out, he's quite happy to pay the people who've only worked the last hour, but not been able to get work earlier, the same as the early people. So it's distributional the other way. Now, um, the failure of distribution, you can show in lots of cases, actually leads to economic deterioration because things don't work properly. But it's a major issue. But again, you need a body of careful thinking that takes these even very early biblical principles and puts them alongside the mess that we have now, where there are arrogant uh, multi-billionaires, trillionaires, and so on who are around things and can't think of anything better to do than go up into space.
Yeah, because ultimately you do see there is so much in both the Old and the New Testament against hoarding, against the hoarding of wealth. And we have come to a society that completely glorifies the hoarding of wealth. Just one more thing that's sort of related to the Mosaic law is the year of Jubilee. You talk a lot about the year of Jubilee, and how could that as a concept, this sort of this forgiveness of debts, this movement of everything back to some base level, how could that speak into our modern Christian witness, do you think?
So yeah, and we we said we had a movement for Christian democracy in the 80s and 90s and tried to get some of this stuff out, but it didn't get far. I mean, the fairly obvious situation is that um, a whole load of people are struggling with debt, and when they are struggling with debt, what do the banks do? They charge them about 20%. Whereas safe lenders, they might charge, between 5 and 10%. So the people who are in a bad way are being pushed down into poverty, and everybody else escapes. Now, that's not ethical banking. That's not good banking. And actually, in the late 19th and early 20th century, what did they call them? The banks that Thatcher got rid of. Well, they were a charitable basis, and they tried to do things better, and there are almost none of them left. So we've actually the banking system has deteriorated in a whole range of ways in even thinking about addressing that problem. And we could do it. It wouldn't take much to either have a government scheme or whatever that help people who were getting close to um, being fundamentally short of money. And if you think of the suffering that there is in families when they're in economic hardship, that matters in straightforward Christian terms.
Yes, I think that's a very, very powerful biblical concept that, we can sort of shy away from. I think that's the Old Testament, but then so much of Jesus's teachings on the kingdom seem to speak into that year of Jubilee, speak into that sort of righteous society. Um, okay, let's move on because we've got lots to cover. Obviously, each one of these areas we could go deeper into. But you talk about the sort of medieval age, and when I'm teaching a course on history of economic thought, I teach about Aquinas and the School of Salamanca, and these sort of medieval, more moral sort of economic systems, just price, and all these sorts of things. You also talk about the guild, how some of this is framed in the guild system and the economics of the abbey, which I must confess I don't know a great deal about. So I thought, could you explain? Could you explain the medieval abbey economic system to us, and how did it work in theory and practice? So how did they draw from this sort of moral economic thought and make it real?
So way back, there was the Weber-Tawney debate, and Weber was a wonderful economist and sociologist and so on, and looked at the ways in which Protestantism helped form the new kind of economics that emerged. And I think there's a very interesting debate that's there in relation to that. But Tawney was quite critical of him, and pointed out that it wasn't the Reformation so much as the long-standing Christian traditions throughout the medieval period that were also important. And over the last 10 or 20 years, you're always wakened up by something, and then you walk backwards and unlearn all the wrong things you've learned and see a different picture. Anyway, so started looking at medieval economics, and especially the place of the abbeys in that. And you had castles all around the place, and people in castles had soldiers and so on. But then you had the abbeys, and the abbeys actually ran a cooperative economy, and that word cooperative is, I think, a very important part of Christian understanding of economics. So the abbeys would install very often fish ponds where people could fish and get their fish from. They would crush the apples. They store the grain over winter. They build big barns that did this. They do the what do you call it, where you make flour, the grinding of flour, either manually or through wind or whatever, and so on. They did that. They did um, healing and medicine of the era. They did schooling and technology and a range of things like that. They gathered the resources of the community so that the resources of the community could live. And basically, I mean, on a local, a national, and a global scale, cooperation like that for what is good, and the word good, I think, needs massive Christian thought. We could go into that, but that's an opening. So they did that, and they did wonderful things. I mean, the two things that happened locally that I came across. One is um, they knocked through a leper's window in our local church, so that the lepers could take part in the service for about 300 years through this window before leprosy was got rid of. Yeah, lovely gesture. And there's a leper chapel down in Cambridge. You probably know it. Yeah, and so that happened. But also when they ploughed ploughed the ground, they did it cooperatively. So they all did one person's plot and then moved on to another person's plot, and it leaves these ridged fields that you see all over the place. And that was essentially, again, a cooperative pattern of farming. So it just seems to me that there's a lot of that underlying cooperative Christian working for one another, caring for one another, that's there in our history, that we've lost in the selfish and ambitious and capitalist sense that comes there in the 20th and 21st century. And boy, do we need it. Do we need cooperation rather than war and everything else? Yeah.
Okay, so maybe we could sort of just change course a bit, because this is very interesting. I think the viewers would be very interested in this, because this is not only churches doing some social some good, helping the poor in some sort of, um, I suppose, I suppose like Mother Teresa says, if I feed the poor, everyone calls me a saint. If I ask why the poor have no food, they call me a communist. In a sense that this sort of medieval abbeys seem to be sort of doing the good things that everyone would agree are good, but they were also impacting society in a positive and good way. They were in a way the ground, a positive foundation to the village economic community. And in that, you talked about the definition of good in that sense. Do you think good is, in some senses, redefining society in a positive way? How would you define good in that way?
The big picture is back to Genesis 1, and God saw that it was good. So our underlying understanding of good is what we're given in the creation, the good earth, the good water, the good sun, the good trees, and so on and so forth. And they are good, and obviously humans are very good and need that kind of care. And evil and sin are problems that we take very seriously, also in economics, and that's where neutral economics in the 20th century, mid 20th century academic sense has really failed because it's not philosophically supportable in any way, and it also destroys the question of what is really good for us. And if we ask the question of what is really good for us in any area, we often come along with very non-technical answers to it. Whether it's in terms of good food or what we need or whatever, or good transport. I mean, transport's the area that I'm most technically involved with over the last 10 or 20 years. And basically, there are three good forms of transport around. Um, One of them is the coach or the bus, but the coach. Another is the train, and another is the scooter or bike. Okay, and we could radically transform most towns by introducing the scooter much more strongly with modifications and so on, and getting away from driving 1.5 people around in a ton or whatever of metal, which is very wasteful and so on. Trains obviously can transport vast quantities of goods as well as people and do it efficiently. And we've just messed up the HS2 train thing by going for speed rather than going for the real thing. And then of course, what was the other one? Was it? Well, I probably missed out walking, but there are all kinds of ways in which it's good to get about, and other ways which are disastrously wrong. And even things like a speed limit of 50 miles an hour would radically transform the way we use cars on the roads. Yeah. So that's good and bad in one sector. But then if you ask across the system, we obviously need to evaluate our economic life, whereas the economics, neutral old style economics, teaches us that there will be a technical answer that just drops out, and we're taught not to evaluate. So I think that's a massive tension that we're inevitably facing now, because in all of these areas we're facing global warming and the failure of it. Yeah.
Yeah, it is very interesting. Yeah, well, obviously, as I say, every one of these topics we go deeper into. Obviously, live in Memphis, Tennessee, where everyone drives these enormous gas guzzling cars, all on credit. all that credit that's going to probably, cause some to drop into poverty. And it's, I suppose for me, the whole, and you talked about consumption theory, that this, you know, obviously the basis of so much of the capitalist system, and it's probably more extreme out here in the United States, is this sense that you are happy if you have this big car and this big house and all these consumer goods, and sort of redefining that at the core seems to be a very, very important thing. It seems to be something that, just that there just seems to be a lack of Christian voices.
So again, we're with a big idolatry, and of course you've got vast uh, empires of advertising pushing product after product after product, and they're doing it on the basis of the idolatry of the self. You deserve, need this, it will make you popular, blah blah blah. It will build, and so, or it will just give you pleasure. And so the self is an idolatry that's built into the system, and the result is that populate probably 20% of what we buy is bad for us, and another 15 or whatever percent we buy in order to sort out the bads, and make it bad. And so the waste, the global waste is crucial. And notice that all of this is effectively not difficult to understand. I mean, this is just so basic. And so we're reclaiming authority for ordinary living out of the hands of the technocratic economists and other people who have been telling us all the way through that it's they that should run the show and decide what the best form of the economy is. So there's a change that's needed there. Yeah.
Yes. Yes, and that is okay, and that's something we could go sort of deeper into, and maybe we'll do in sort of future talks. But I want to come back to the book, and then because you move on from the sort of medieval age, I suppose, to the early modern age, particularly the 17th century. Um, the and I'm an amateur historian of the Civil War. I studied history at Cambridge under John Morrill, who was very religiously inspired man, a great thinker on the Civil War. And I always when I love that, how so much of England has been defined ultimately by the Civil War, and so you talk a lot about what sort of sprung up in the 17th century. So I wanted to sort of ask, like, really, when we look at the sort of 17th century and the incredible experimentation socially and economically that was proposed, that really happened, what has that got to teach us today? And in the 21st century, how could that influence us now? The experience of the Commonwealth and the radical sects and all that.
Yeah, I mean, I love this stuff because partly we're in the middle of it here, with Cromwell up the road, and all the rest of it, and the levelers and the diggers and equality and living before God is. I just wonder if even we can reclaim that, so that what we what we so often seem to have now is Christians going to church, and the the world, the secular world as it calls itself, has neatly put us in the church and locked us up there for a few hours a week, and we come out and we're back in the secular world. So we don't have any influence out here, whereas of course those great people in the 17th century thought and did living before God in all kinds of areas. I mean, I just love the scientific revolution in the 17th century and the way those guys were thinking God's thoughts out after him, and really started off the whole of modern science. The whole of modern science, by faith, Christian from the beginning, and you know, at least at that stage, and so they did science, and then I'll put a bit of art in here. Well, one of my favourite paintings is the Avenue at Middle Harness. Um, it's Hobbema's painting, middle of the 17th century. And you've got this rather weird painting of a load of trees that are very straight and very tall. And then on the side, there's a tree orchard where they're growing little trees. And I mean, I looked at this for 20 or 30 years before I really asked what's going on here. And then I did. And it's fairly obvious that what they're doing is growing building timbers by just pruning them every year so that they stay straight. And it's brilliant. So you finish up with these tall, straight trees, and you know, these guys are living in God's creation, working with the creation, and doing what's good to produce results that are good. So that's a long way away from the levelers and the diggers and the justice thing. But basically, yeah, I mean, the tragedy is that that flowered for a few years, and then they managed to get rid of Cromwell, who made some mistakes, but get rid of Cromwell and made some mistakes, and then reimpose the monarchy and the landed gentry and the enforced poverty of the other classes. Yeah, yeah. I mean, you should be saying that's
Okay, yeah. Well, it's interesting. Just as a completely, this is just a thought experiment. Could it have turned out differently? Could there have been a different England from if the Commonwealth had continued? Do you think?
yeah, Commonwealth. The idea of Commonwealth is a wonderful idea, isn't it? And obviously, it's there in parks and all kinds of other things. But yeah, maybe if Cromwell hadn't fought in Ireland, if he hadn't been so militarist, it could have been different. The first great revolution. Yeah,
It's interesting, isn't it? Because though, one thing I always, and often wanted to write something on this, that it was actually Cromwell that sort of started the Jamaican plantation system, and just been interesting, always trying to find thinkers from that era that were anti-colonial, you know, and it's sometimes a little bit difficult, it's sometimes difficult to compare thought over time, isn't it? I always wonder if there were, actual sort of anti-colonial critiques around at that time. I'd love to find one.
yeah. I know the feeling, and the point. I'm afraid the conclusion. And if you study the Pilgrim Fathers and the early pattern in the States, the conclusion is even more straightforward, is that Christianity was compromised into colonialism during that period, and that was a serious failure of Christianity. And one of the things we've got to do is to own up to all the failures we have, um, that have been there over a long period of time, and have produced the lunatic you get in the White House now, and the kind of Christian guff that surrounds him. Yeah,
Yeah, it's interesting, and that's coming back to our sort of main point, is that there are a lot of young people that are confused in terms of their sort of moral compass, and I think the whole, as you say, the mistakes that Christianity has made over the time, that the backing of these sort of negative systems, even the seemingly creating theology and an ideology for these very negative economic systems and systems of enslavement and power. um, yeah, that's where a lot of young people are like, well, do I want to be part of this Christianity? But then when you actually, as you say, when you go into scriptures and see that there is something very, very, very different, and it's, the question is, how do we get that out there into the world,
Yeah, so I think there's something in Jesus' teaching that is just so important in relation to this. So um, you must be born again. Well, we all know what that means. It's being born again to God and away from, so that's fine. Unless you become like little children, you can't enter the kingdom of God. Well, does that mean we have to be childlike? And so maybe in all of this, Jesus is teaching us about unlearning and you know, they say unto you, but I say unto you, and unlearning, getting off the broad road that leads to destruction, and it is a much bigger part of life than ever is allowed in education or in any other area or economics and so on. But unlearning stuff that has been part of the secular uh, Eurocenter culture that we've grown up in, and so on. I mean, the drastic need for America to unlearn so much that it has taken for granted over the last 10, 20, 100 years is now, I hope, very clear to people over there. I know it hasn't got through to some yet, but a lot of Christians will have seen that this is just something that we must depart from and relearn, proves that they're far deeper and have been promoted in the States by good Christian people and economists at all kinds of periods.
Yes. Yes, we've all got, yeah, and this as and now, obviously the book sort of needs a lot of unlearning. So let's go into that, because obviously in your book, embedded in it is quite a deep critique of classical economics. Um, especially where, and I would say this is a slightly, you're critiquing the cherry-picked Smith, in the sense that a lot of Adam Smith's modern acolytes just take certain of his sort of mechanistic forces he talks about and build a whole ideology based on that. So you're very critical of Smith and the mechanical conception of economic forces. And in some senses, it, my big problem with Smith is his faith, or his conception of God. Because I believe that, coming from a very theist background, he had this vision of God as this sort of orderer of the universe and this being that stepped out of it, which is a very sort of late 18th century idea. And that led him to sort of, he wanted to find the mechanical forces that ran economies in the same way as people were finding the physical forces, and I think that's a problem. I think it's a massive theological problem. And so, this is your time. What is your view of Adam Smith and his influence on modern economics?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think you're possibly slightly rosy in the sense that David Hume probably got him drunk quite a few times, and they were close buddies. And David Hume was a thoroughgoing atheist and hated the Scottish Church. Um, and but in a sense, Hume, sorry, Smith creates the problem that he then solves in the sense that he eradicates morality, as it's come to be called, from economics, and then has a theory of moral sentiments that brings it back in. So he can be quite a nice guy when he puts it all together. And again, acknowledging that free trade in the Smithian sense was better than the imperial stuff that was going on. So it's not dumping on Smith, but it's it's just that the morality has become not good enough because it has to do with sex and a few other things, but it doesn't incorporate the meaning of the whole of life in terms of what we do before God. And that's what was so great about the Reformation, and it's what's so great about the gospel, and quite clearly, Jesus invites us to that all the time. So, if we're doing a painting, then we're doing it before God. If we're cooking a meal, we're doing it before God, and everything is imbued with this deep significance. And the Christian life is 7 days a week and not one, and that holistic vision must be something that the church returns to. And when that happens, then we'll be in with another reformation. And reformation, reformation of life before God is what a straightforward. I mean, this isn't anything that's radical. It's just the gospel that we've all been reading all our lives. So Adam Smith goes on, and he founds a discipline, and it becomes neutral and values free, and there are the various modes of production and all the rest of it. But I think it's then that, in a sense, the wagon gets going in a certain direction that cuts out a whole load of the deepest issues of living economically. Yeah.
Yeah, so this sort of sense of, I suppose, reality being economic forces, and you have no control over them, and if you mess up, if the government tries to step in and mess up, it causes all this dead weight loss, and it messes up all our nice crafts.
All of these positions are used by various people who want to do things their own selfish way. So, we've got to keep the government out of economic life, say the capitalists, so that basically they can have a free run to do what they want, and then the monetary people do the same thing. So there are positions that change and are used, and you can follow them through in the history of economic thought in a whole variety of ways that are part of this. But behind that lies this deep Christian critique that isn't difficult. It's just the whole of life before God, and what is good and what is, and single sentences like the meek shall inherit the earth. If we don't understand what meekness is, we won't have an earth to inherit. That sentence is deep, 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 so deep and big that we all need to be under it. Yeah.
Excellent, that's good. And I'm going to sort of finish off with a wider sort of question about your thought. But is there anything else you want to, and in points you make from the book, that you would like to share with the audience?
It just is that for all of us, ordinary people, the ordinary business of life together and the way we live economically should be principled. It should take care of others. It should be both global and local and so on. And all of this is there in the covenantal way in which God deals with us. And I mean, let me just return, if you like, to one word, which is the word stewardship, which Bob Gutzwald, my supervisor, great economist, made the center of the meaning of economic life. We are stewarding God's resources on the planet. And if we don't understand that in the next 10 years, it will be horrific. That 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 really is the issue. Global warming, aside from war and peace, global warming is the major issue for the whole planet, and already we're committing a whole lot of people in the equatorial areas to horrors that are unthinkable, as well as our own, and so on. So stewardship, careful tending of all the goods that we've been given us, all the wonderful things we've been given us just to live, um, are, are, are crucial. And we do that before God, and it's a straightforward Christian response. It's not complicated, it's not deeply doctrinal or whatever. You can't even argue about it. It's just what we have to do before the living God.
That's great, and it's great to sort of hear sort of your views on all these different areas. Now, I'm always told I'm not a very good economist because I don't like arguing. I'm quite a gentle soul, but I think probably the last question is somewhat of a curveball. It's somewhat of a, questioning some of the basis of what you're saying. Um, Obviously, as I say, I had a very sort of deep grounding in Marxism.
Go on, go for it.
uh, And obviously, Marx falls on an awful lot of levels, but it particularly falls on the human nature, and in some senses, I think me coming to terms with my own sort of how I couldn't really, if I had any sort of authority in this future society that we were going to create, I had to face who I was as a sinful being, and I think was part of my journey to Christ, actually realizing, I would rail against sexism or, materialism, but I could see those things within me, um, and so when we talk about only Christian economics remains, obviously the big question I keep coming back to is, you know, um, would everyone need a changed heart in Christ? Would everyone need to be born again? Or in some senses, is this more of a prophetic critique of society, or like the Abbey system, creation of something, a different economy that others could come into? How do you see it in terms of the kingdom of God, kingdom of darkness dynamic, and the whole question of the sinful nature and the redeemed nature?
Yeah, so going back to Marx, uh, revolutions weren't a great idea, and the workers as the infallible leaders wasn't either. So on the whole, it didn't kind of go anywhere. But I think the crucial issue for us as Christians is very different. We actually have 2 billion Christians around the world. That's about 25% of the world's population, 1 in 4. Okay, and that group of people has never acted together before in human history. They got a bit close to it in the 1920s, leading up to 1932, but they've never acted together and thought together. And we've been taught by decades of secularism to think that the stuff that we do is on the edge rather than being mainstream. Okay, now, I mean, one of my Christian teachers, I think it was Schaeffer. Schaeffer used to say, God is never antithesis, God is always thesis. So we're never reacting against, because to use another metaphor, we're always playing on home ground. We're we're playing where it is. So instantly we can do all kinds of stuff. It might relate to how we control our waste, what use of second-hand goods we make, what work we do, what the way we structure this, that, and the other. We can always, any Christian can do anything, anywhere, all the time, and we can communicate against it. And that will mean old-style good works like, helping the poor and so on. And it will mean a whole range of other stuff that is less obviously Christian. It will involve reform movements and so on. So if we really understood that we, the 2 billion people around the world, okay, lovely people working in every country on the planet, um, doing all kinds of things, we're working together in the same way for what is good and for what is meek, and so on. Then it's a simple lesson. You don't need any economist to teach you. You don't need to agree to teach you. You just need to. This is the central truth. Yeah. So stewardship, living before God and the whole church together uh, as the body of Christ, just receiving instructions from the head and living that way. I mean, we all know what the gospel says. It's not difficult.
I particularly like your point about how secularism pushes us to the margins, and you're saying no. You're saying, only Christian economics remains. This has to be the basis of how we live our lives and try and influence society, and we should know the authority of God in that. Yeah, so that's a very powerful sort of statement, really, and yeah. Okay, so much we could carry on talking about, but I think that's our sort of time up. But yeah, any final words you want to add, or?
No, just thank you for helping me sort out stuff. That was great. Thanks, Jake.